Our next speaker has a comprehensive background in the auto industry, and that is probably a perfect platform if you want to make change happen in that field. Our speaker is in charge of corporate social responsibility. Please welcome Stéphane Renie.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, and sorry for coming right after lunch with a presentation in English, but I'm sure you'll be fine. It's a pleasure being here today and talking to you a little bit about ALD and the way we think about sustainable mobility, and very precisely what are our plans for the near future in that space. I cannot start a presentation on sustainability here in Sweden without talking about climate change first. You are the country of Greta Thunberg, and where it all started recently in terms of the students' mobilization around this. And just to bring this into figure and set the scene in general term, this is, if we want to keep the global warming to 1.5 degrees maximum by 2050, what we would need collectively to achieve in terms of CO2 emissions worldwide. So we are at the top of the curve, and what it should look like to get to zero net emissions by 2050, which is what it takes to achieve that ambition, is actually a very drastic fall that has to start now. And of course, it's not just about us as consumers and private individuals to make that happen, but it's also about for the business community to take part in this process. So we as ALD, of course, have put sustainable mobility at the very core of our corporate social responsibility strategy and roadmap. It has, of course, other pillars like the development of human capital, how we reassess our processes to be a responsible company and having ethical practices, reducing our own internal carbon footprint. But what is, I think, what contributes in the most material way to our environmental and social impact is obviously the services we provide, the types of cars that we lease to our customers. So a very strong focus going forward on low emission fleets, new types of usage and safety, which are the main dimensions or the main drivers. Because for a company like ourselves, sustainable mobility in very simple terms is about two main things. To put it very simply and bluntly, it's about the vehicles themselves, so the pieces of metal or carbon on four wheels or less wheels sometimes, and the new types of usage as well. Where you see a lot of the keywords that are very much in fashion these days around carpooling, car sharing, mutualization of usage, mobility on demand, mobility as a service. All the new types of packages, bundles, way of selling our products, which are moving a little bit away from the traditional one person, one car kind of setup. And it's really the mix of these two things. Being very cautious about the type of the profile of the fleet portfolio we have together with you customers, and the new services package that we will basically move towards the objective that was on the previous slide. If we focus on cars, which will be my main topic today, what we basically need to achieve today is a very challenging equation, where on the one side we want to minimize the impact of these cars both on climate, so that's largely through the CO2 variable, but also very much on environment and pollution. So this is where you see the nitrogen oxides and the particulate matters entering into the scene, because it relates strongly to health and pollution issues. So it's true to say that climate is a major driver, but the other dimension, of course, is very high on the agenda of municipalities in particular, because it's about the local health of local inhabitants. But at the same time, we're in the real world, we're serving real businesses who've got real business needs. So we need these cars to be adapted to real world usage, not breaking your productivity as clients. We need them to be affordable, and we know this is an issue today, not just in terms of the initial price tag, but in terms of total cost of usage. We need these cars to be attractive. I think our clients today, generally speaking, are not really ready to make drastic compromises on design or comfort just because the car is green. So the expectations are high. And also there is a key question from a very operational point of view on availability of these cars. And you were right in asking the gentleman from Volvo questions about production volumes. That's a key dimension. So far, we've really had trouble, us as an industry, to get access to greener cars and to get access to them at reasonable prices as well. But anyway, so this is the equation. The way we see the market going forward is one where we go from a very simple world where basically diesel was the universal answer to all questions, at least in Europe, to a much more complex scene. This is a slide from a British consultancy company which we have reworked, and we kind of share the vision of what the passenger car market is going to look like within the next 10 years, so to speak. So you see it's a mix of different technologies, and different technologies according to different sizes of cars, where you see a lot of small electric vehicles in the city car space. You see plug-in hybrids very much coming from the top end of the market, because this is an expensive technology in essence. You see a lot of gasoline or petrol cars with various degrees of hybridization, all the way from mild hybrid to full hybrids. And you can still see diesel, but in a corner of the market, relative to, I would say, larger SUVs, basically cars which can bear the cost of what passing the next norms on diesel will imply, and that's going to be massive. So really a shift between a one-size-fits-all scenario to much more complex car policies, because for us as the fleet industry, there is of course a third dimension, which is probably the most important one, is that it's usage. And what are the cars being used for? Because the right technological answer for a customer fleet on a C-segment car can be very different according to whether the car is used by a pharma representative driving 400 kilometers per day on motorways, or the same car being driven in an urban circle, basically to do 50 kilometers. And from that point, of course, we can have the right recommendation in terms of which technology to use going forward. So this is basically the scene of what it will look like and what it will transition to. The fundamental question is why, and what the one we get from customers these days is, okay, electric cars, we hear a lot about them. There is a very strong push. We heard the product plan from Volvo earlier, but all the OEMs are pushing very, very hard. Does it actually make sense? There is, issues around the production of batteries. There is what happens at the end of life, and so on. So we've tried to answer that question modestly. To make a long story short, last year ALD went to the financial markets and issued a green bond. And when pitching this green bond to investors, we had to demonstrate that the cars that the green bond was going to finance, which were electrified vehicles, made sense from an environmental and social point of view, but not just when they are driving, but from an entire life cycle perspective, including production and end of life. So at the end of the day, we compared different technologies in different countries and basically green cars with an equivalent baseline vehicle, should it be petrol or diesel according to the market. And this is showing you the gap in terms of life cycle emissions of a given electric vehicle compared to an equivalent petrol or diesel according to the market on two key variables, which were CO2 and NOx. So what this is telling you basically is that electric vehicles are of course not zero emission when you look at the global picture. This is a complete myth, and everybody knows that now. But basically they allow to cut the emissions by 2, which is massive. So more or less minus 50% emissions on a life cycle basis. And the same thing applies to NOx. And you also see a very positive picture on PHEVs and hybrids, to make it short. The other learning from that study was, of course, that you're talking about a minus 49% or minus 45% emissions. But the issue is, or the complexity is, that, of course, these emissions do not come from the same place as from internal combustion engines. For internal combustion engines, which is the graph on the right every time, you see that the majority of the emissions come from the blue space, which is linked to usage. So what comes out of the exhaust pipe? So the typical CO2 measurement from the OEMs, as we've known it forever, which has been, of course, drastically changed with WLTP that you heard from this morning. And then also a little bit on car production and so on. If you look at battery electric vehicles, just looking at BEVs to simplify, you see that the CO2 emissions and the NOx emissions come from a very different part of the value chain, which is the green and the dark gray one. The green one being the production of electricity, and the dark gray one, which is the production of the cars or the production of batteries. So that is helping everyone in our community, not just the investors, but also our clients, to understand where the added value is coming from. The other dimension, which is very important, is the country factor. What we saw is that this is showing you more or less the same figure as before, so minus 49, minus 45 for battery electric vehicles, but broken down by country of utilization. And you can see that depending on the country, so basically depending on how the electricity is produced and whether or not it comes from it's decarbonated or coming from renewable sources, or on the other extreme, generated by coal power stations, the picture is drastically different. You can see that countries where the picture is extremely favorable are France, Norway, and Sweden, where it's either very high on nuclear or renewables, nuclear posing other problems, but at least from a carbon dioxide point of view, it's positive. And on the other extreme, you can see countries like China or Poland, which show a negative picture in a way, where basically an electric vehicle is more emitting in terms of CO2 because all the electricity that it consumes locally is coming from coal. So in Sweden, and this is my first point, you have an ideal picture. If you look at this map of the electricity grid across Europe, coming from an independent site, basically the more green the country is, the more green the electricity is. And you can see you're in a very good position. So you actually maximize or tick a lot of boxes. And the overall carbon impact of an EV in Sweden is minus 60% more or less, or close to 70% compared to an equivalent petrol or diesel engine. So a massive environmental and social or pollution impact if you make that kind of choices in a country like Sweden. Where we are today as ALD is, I'm not going to go into all the bullet points, but it's a very I would say mixed situation, if we want to speak honestly. A lot of geographical discrepancies, an understanding of what electrified vehicles stand for, which is very diverse across the markets. A picture which, from a financial point of view and a TCO perspective, is still not that favorable for electric cars, but the figures are coming very, or much closer every day, thanks to the effort we're making on residual values, thanks to governmental subsidies, thanks to more cars available on the market as well. We have a strong push and a strong interest from our clients, corporates and also private individuals. We still have quite a massive sourcing issue, being accessing the cars that I was talking about earlier. And an equation which for us is quite difficult to solve, because we've got to put a lot of things in place for electric vehicles, and I'll come back to that afterwards, still with reasonably small volumes. This is why we have put together an enterprise program on electrification, where basically the idea is to look at every single step of our value chain as a service company, and reassess everything we do, asking ourselves, is this going to work for electric vehicles? Do we need to reinvent new processes? Is there an opportunity to do things differently? Is there an opportunity to invent new ways of working? And we reassess, as I said, all parts of the chain, all the way from how we price vehicles. So this is one example, residual value setting. I know the pricing manager of ALD Sweden has talked to you this morning, where we need to rethink about our mindset and mental software. Residual value setting within a leasing company historically has consisted into looking at history and extrapolating into the future. If you look at history for residual value setting on electric cars, it's basically completely useless because there's nothing to look at in terms of used car sale values. And if there is anything to look at, you're talking about cars which were marketed like 5-6 years ago, so a completely different technology than the new EVs coming into the market today. So this is an area where we've got to change our processes. Another area on the positive side, which is about business opportunities, is the one around partnerships. You will have a gentleman from Ion talking next after me. Electrification for us brings also the potential to think about our product differently, and also opening new sales channels. So the partnership that we have signed with Ion at international level consists, among other things, at marketing together offers for electric vehicles to the Ion customer base. So using Ion as a kind of white label partner in the same way as we work with car manufacturers or insurance companies or banks to sell our products. So these two examples show you how basically electric vehicles are changing the game for a company like ALD, and it's not at all business as usual, in fact. If there is one area where we need to actually do a lot of work, it's on the commercial side, because if you just replace, and I'm talking to experts here, if you just replace a diesel car with an electric car and think that the job is done, of course you are sure to create a complete disaster, because then it would mean that the client has to take care himself about choosing the cars, putting the right infrastructure in place, both at home and in the office, finding a solution for the public charging, etc., etc. So what we need to build as a service company is a kind of augmented offer, if you like, which would contain and which is going to contain the traditional bricks of what a full service leasing offer usually stands for in terms of financing, maintenance, assistance, tires, etc., plus a number of things. Number of things being the capability to have in the lease a home charger, the capability to include or at least enable or facilitate access to public charging or office charging. The capability to, of course, retrieve in terms of data flows the electricity consumption, etc., etc. The other thing which is interesting in that thing is that in the same way as I was talking about new partnerships, there is also new service opportunities for us. I will just, which we called here EV enablers. I will just mention one example, which is a product we launched in France 6-9 months ago called ALD Switch. This is a full service leasing product on an electric vehicle where bundled under the monthly lease, you have included the possibility to switch your electric car for a combustion engine car for up to 60 days a year for your summer vacation, weekends, short breaks, spring breaks, whatever. And it's all in the same bundle. So that is really reducing the fear of customers, which could be, okay, for daily use, for my daily commute, the electric car is going to be okay. But what happens if? So this is covering that part. So this is typically illustrating that it comes with challenges, but also quite a number of opportunities. I will conclude with our ambitions on electric vehicles before leaving you the floor. What you can see on the left is the trend of our electrified fleet within ALD on a global basis, covering both hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and electric vehicles. So the trend is quite clear. Always the same story, plus 50% growth year on year from a reasonably low base. But still, we achieved at the end of 2018 the number of 100,000 vehicles managed in that electrified space, out of 1.6 million worldwide. So you could argue this is still a one-digit number, but clearly the figures are growing. What we think we can achieve and what we are determined to make happen is an acceleration, basically. The market is maturing. The OEMs, as you have understood, have a very strong interest in pushing some electric or electrified volumes next year. So together with the work we are doing internally, which I shared with you before, we think that we can reach 200,000 contracts electrified by the end of next year, and that this green products will represent during that year at least 20% of all new contracts that we will put on the road. And when you reach this kind of proportion, you are no more talking about something which is a niche business, but we are really talking about something which is at the heart of our business model and, of course, in our profit and loss accounts. My final word would be, well, actually, the challenge for you is how much Sweden is going to contribute to that number. And my main message today is that you have all it takes to take a very strong share. You have a very green power grid. You have very active home-based OEMs. You have a reasonably high purchasing power, generally speaking. So really, I expect that the electrification journey, well, not starts here, but at least goes through Sweden and what we see, and we build together an electrified future. Thank you for your attention.